Welcome, everyone, on behalf of the Adult Education Committee. As many of you probably know, this is part of our ongoing series, Foundations of Faith, which really is focused on scripture and biblical teaching. So we're very happy to have Lucy with us and applaud her willingness to take on certainly one of the more challenging books in the Bible, Revelation. So we're very pleased that these next 3 weeks we'll be able to discuss and learn more about that book. But as we begin, I'd like to just open with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for this opportunity to be together and to celebrate and your word and to dive into understanding more deeply what you have revealed to us through the book of Revelation. We thank you for each and every person that's here, and we ask that you will keep us all safe and well in the next 3 weeks as we work together in this class. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. So what I'm going to do with this class is actually a little bit of an adjustment to the original thought that the Adult Ed Committee had in mind, because what I'd like to do is really lead up to Revelation by looking at texts that happen in the Bible prior to the book of Revelation, because I think in a lot of ways, if we get a grounding in what Jesus talked about with end times, the eschatology, apocalyptic, which I'm going to define all that in a few minutes. It really grounds us in both what Jesus understood as his, if you will, self-disclosure about those texts. And then if we look at what the Apostle Paul talked about with his understanding of what was coming in terms of end times, then I think we can get to Revelation. And what we'll probably end up doing is getting to Revelation in terms of looking at that book, and we'll realize that we've just scratched the surface in 1 week. So probably what will happen is that we will pick that up again in the fall with this series and go into more depth in Revelation. So with that said, I really want to help you understand, or have you understand, kind of where I'm going to be going with this particular text. Thank you. So Allison, excellent. We're going to be looking at this theme of end times, and I'm calling it End Times, A New Look. So what I'd like to do, let me just give you a sketch of where we're going with this, just so you know kind of this, how we're going to structure our time. So with the Foundations of Faith class, any of you that have been part of that through the clergy leading these classes, I know Matt Helms did one, I know that Jeff Doan just did something on the prophets, I know that my colleague Joe Morrow did something on diaspora communities. So we take, each of us take an area of the Bible that we find to be compelling or confusing, or just want to focus on it. And so in this instance, this is Lucy's choice for this term of the Foundations of Faith. So what I'd like to do is begin with some background on the concept of eschatology or the Apocrypha. I'd like to begin with that and spend a little bit of time grounding us in what this particular understanding and aspect of the biblical narrative is about. And we're going to look actually at one text in Matthew 24, which is Jesus talking to the disciples about the end. And we're going to spend time today really roaming around in that particular text. And I'm going to give you some background. So this is sort of the introduction to this area of scripture, but I want to give you even a little more grounding in the Gospel of Matthew, just so that you know kind of where we end up, how we end up in Matthew 24, what's come before it, what has come immediately preceding the text we'll look at, and then what is going on in this particular text of Matthew 24. So if you have a Bible, feel free to pull it out, but if you don't have one handy, It's all right, because we're going to look at the text on the screen. Then after we're finished with this kind of formal presentation, I'll pause and you can ask questions. Then what I'd like to do is have us do some application, a little bit of conversation in small groups with each other about what you've heard, about your assumptions, what you've carried into the class, and then spend times there. Then we will come back together, hear a little bit about where you went in your discussion. And then today, I think that'll use up the hour. And so I think it's going to be a pretty fast clip, but I don't want to just be kind of lecturing without giving you an opportunity to ask questions or being able to clarify points. So what I'd like to do, if you're all right with it, is just to go ahead and basically move through this background information on the particular text we're looking at. Okay, and if you are not muted, it would be probably helpful to mute right now. I mean, unless, you know, if you have a question, please, I would ask either Michael or probably Michael, if you could kind of monitor the chat, just open it up in case someone asks a question. It's a little bit hard for me to both look at the screen, look at my notes, and look at the chat. So if there's something, if there's anything that comes up, interrupt me, okay? All right. So the first, we're here. This is an interesting graphic, kind of puts us in a mode of, oh my goodness, what's coming? So if you want to go to the next one, the next, Allison, if you, yeah, thank you. Okay, so this is our first week. What did Jesus say about the end times and how do we understand it now? And it's called an introduction to the apocalyptic thinking and eschatology. And in a moment, I'm going to make you hold those two terms because I'm going to define them in a bit, but I'm not going to do it right now, just so that you can be waiting for that to happen. Okay. Go ahead to the next one. So what I'd like to do now, actually, I have a little bit of background before we actually read the scripture passage. Some of you may wonder why I would have chosen to take up this text on the end times or texts on the end times. And why this class, why now? So let me give you a little, let me tip my hand, okay, about why it is that I think it's important for us.
Thank you. I appreciate your help.
Be looking at. Hi, Sam. Welcome.
Hi.
So why this class right now? So we know that so much in the past weeks and months have been so unsettling in our lives. And oftentimes, historically, when things are spinning out of control in the world, we may ask the question, where is all of this going? And we might even ask the question, where is God in the middle of this? Or where is God leading this? Or where is God supporting us through this time? And though we may not immediately go to a biblical narrative of the signs of the end times, there are plenty of people in our culture, in our society, in our world that do. And we might take a more, some of us, some people, and even some among us may take a pretty clear, kind of almost what I call an absolutist view of looking at these biblical texts and the ones that are about the end times, particularly in Revelation is where a lot of people go. But there's other texts as well. The one that we'll look at today is another one. And people might look at those as predictions, or assuming that Jesus' discourse is a foretelling, a kind of cosmic battle between the cosmic forces of the world, kind of the good and evil of the world, and that in some ways, what gets laid out in the biblical text is seen as a kind of prediction of what's to come. We're nearing the end, and Jesus is going to return in glory. We might, if we don't take that particular way of reading these texts, we might take a more metaphorical view of Jesus' understanding of what these texts are about, and think that it's just simply a time of unsettling, and that we have to endure our way through these times because that is the mandate that Jesus puts on the disciples and by extension on us, that when really hard things happen, our role or the way that we need to be in the world and be connected is not so much prediction of the end, but waiting and hoping and enduring and being ready for the way that God will come among us and reveal God's self to us. So there's ways that people go at these texts in very different ways. And I am really happy to, I'm not going to say that I'm an authority on the way that people understand this, the kind of Hal Lindsey's and other people who wrote books like Left Behind, the Left Behind series, or those kind of, that kind of literature, which we'll get to the third week. So we're going to at least have some familiarity with that. But for the moment, I want you to understand that this, walking into this territory and working in this territory, okay. I thought you couldn't hear because of the sound. But walking into this territory and being part of this territory does lead us and bring forward some of that thinking. And it's not only thinking in contemporary society, but we know there have been millennial movements, if you will, people who have throughout history people have stood on mountaintops waiting for Jesus to come and had figured out through numerology and other things exactly when Jesus might come. And they would literally go to the top of the mountain waiting, and then it didn't happen. And so then they had to kind of rethink or recalculate or figure it out. So there's all kinds of things on the ground in various religious traditions that various, I guess, expressions of Christianity that may lead us to that. So I just think it's a rather interesting topic, and no matter where one lands on your understanding of the end times, the descriptions of what is coming in terms of what Jesus is talking about is serious business. And we may long for making sense of the time in which we're living, and also try to understand what Jesus meant by this, and does it have any relevance for us today? So that's the reason that I thought it would be interesting to do this study. So with that said, I would like for us now to go through this scripture passage. And if I could get people to just read someone to read the first slide and then another person read the second slide, so you're not just hearing my voice, but I can't see who might volunteer. So if you wouldn't mind, just Michael DeVries, would you be willing to start us out? And then if someone else would be willing to step in, just unmute and read what you see on the screen, that would be terrific.
Do you want me to just read the first bullet point?
Just read both of them. Just read the whole chunk that shows up.
Okay, very good. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things? He asked. Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. Then verse 3 is, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?
Okay, would someone else read, please?
I'd be happy to.
Great, thank you, Jim.
Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains.
Thank you. Someone else?
I'll read it. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come.
Great. Someone else?
I'll do it. So when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again.
Someone else be willing to read the next? I know we're getting into some kind of unsettling territory here.
I'll take it.
Thanks, David.
If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or there he is, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is, out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather.
I'll read.
Great. Thank you, Marcia.
Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other.
All right. Wow. So if we were in person, a little hard to do on Zoom, I would definitely love to hear your reactions to this, but we're going to get to that. So we won't do that right now. It's a little bit hard to have a full group conversation. But I'd like to give you a little bit of background on this passage. So in order to really read any biblical text, we need to understand the context. And that sounds like a rather obvious statement, but I think it's really, really important, especially when we're dealing with either troubling texts or confusing texts or texts that have a lot to them that you just don't see on the surface. So I want to give you a little bit of background prior to us really taking up the themes within this text. So let's start with the whole Gospel of Matthew. So how does this fit into the larger narrative of the Gospels, and particularly the Gospel of Matthew? First of all, it's really important to understand when we say, how does it fit into the larger narrative of the Gospels, that much of the material in the Gospel of Matthew actually came from Mark's Gospel. So scholars assume that Mark's Gospel was the earliest Gospel. And if you did a study of what was in Matthew and Luke, not John, but Matthew and Luke, you would see a lot of parallels. When I was in seminary, we had this book called The Gospel Parallels. It literally lined up Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and showed what the overlapping texts were. So in this particular passage, Much of the material in this passage is drawn from Mark's gospel, as well as another source they call the Q source. And we don't need to go into all this biblical, how things made up the gospels, but the Q source was a source that they weren't quite sure. It was actually a compilation of a whole lot of material. But if you did a comparison with what is in Matthew's gospel as different from what is in Mark's gospel in this same text, you would begin to see that probably the audience was different, because Matthew did some sort of editing of this text to basically focus on his audience. We assume that Mark's gospel was actually written, or at least most of it was written, prior to the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, 770 Common Era. And we assume that Matthew's gospel was written after the destruction of the temple. So if you're interested in doing this study, you can look at Mark 13 as the sort of comparison text to see what emphasis Matthew put on it as different from Mark. Okay, so basically, and then Luke 17, which I understand one of the men's discussion groups is going through the Gospel of Luke and looked at that text last week, because Tom Forster Smith is in that group, and he came to me and said, I know you're talking about the end times. Guess what? We're looking at that this week. So Luke 17 is the other text that would be a common text with this one. I bring that up because I think it's really important, again, to understand what the audience was at Jesus, Matthew's gospel, Jesus' narrative was focused on. So if you think about the destruction of the temple, then it's an interesting thing when the disciples asked Jesus, sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking down at the span of Jerusalem below them. Anybody who's ever been to that area knows the whole city is sitting in front of you. And they asked Jesus, starting this text, well, what about the temple? What about the destruction of the temple? It's always going to be there. And Jesus basically states that not one stone will be on another stone. And that's for starters. And then Jesus doesn't spend a whole lot of time on the destruction of the temple in this, but begins to talk about his own return post-resurrection. So you can see that even the way that Jesus is looking at that the presentation of Jesus in Matthew and his focus is very different. Matthew was likely, not hugely different, but a lot of different emphases. Matthew was likely a Jewish Christian who was living in diaspora away from the city of Jerusalem post-temple destruction, probably in Antioch, though we don't know for sure. And you remember that that's where the Apostle Paul is from, Antioch. The central message of the Gospel of Matthew really shows up in the Sermon on the Mount. So the Sermon on the Mount is probably, if you think of the Gospel of Matthew and its distinct contribution to our life as Christians, the Sermon on the Mount is the anchor text for living the Christian life. And in many ways, Matthew and the focus of his material throughout the gospel really quotes more than any other gospel, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And there's all these kind of fulfillment texts in that Jesus is the Messiah, the fulfillment of the prophecies of the Hebrew Bible. But also, the Sermon on the Mount, in many ways, it was on a mountain, much like Moses went up the mountain. And so Jesus, in the mind of the gospel writer, as he's narrating the life of Jesus, would say, in many ways, that Jesus is sort of the new Moses. And the people are the people who have been wandering in the wilderness. So we have wilderness texts. We have all kinds of things that are parallels. I don't want to go into too much of this, but I want to at least give you the context of what was going on in the Gospel of Matthew. Some scholars have divided up the Gospel of Matthew into three sections. Some have done five, kind of like the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the holy books of the Hebrew Bible, the first 5. But a lot of scholars really think there's 3 sections of Matthew, and I'm getting us to this Matthew 24 text. The first would be the person of Jesus, the Messiah, which is sort of chapters 1 through 12. And then the proclamation that Jesus is the Messiah. So the person of Jesus, the proclamation of Peter's confession, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, in Matthew 13. And this is a pivot or hinge point from Jesus as the person into being named by Peter as the Messiah, and then his journey to Jerusalem and the suffering, death, and resurrection of the Messiah. So where in the gospel do we find this particular text, Matthew 24? What has just happened? Well, Jesus had a very active ministry, Sermon on the Mount, moved through the Peter's confession, a lot of things have happened, but Jesus then, the triumphal entry, Jesus goes to Jerusalem. And so this text takes place after the triumphal entry, after Palm Sunday. It also takes place after the cleaning of the temple, which is really important to realize that Jesus has just gone into Jerusalem, and his first act is to go to the temple and cleanse it of all the money changers and all the things that were happening there that he saw as sort of abomination. So then we can imagine what happens. Then Jesus, after being in Jerusalem, then goes with the disciples back up to the Mount of Olives. And this conversation is happening right then, right there on the Mount of Olives. And it's kind of like one of the commentators said, the come to Jesus moment with the disciples, where they come to Jesus literally and ask Jesus, well, if the temple's destroyed, then, and you're not with us anymore, then what's going to happen? And how do we stay firm or stand firm in the faith? But even more important is think about the audience to which Matthew was writing. Post-resurrection, early Christian community, people trying to make sense of the Sermon on the Mount, people trying to make sense of what does it mean to be a Christian, whether you are a Christian who came out of a Jewish background or a Christian who came out of a Gentile background. What does it mean to be a Christian in this very, very early time of the 1st century BCE or CE? So we can imagine that people are leaning forward to hear and to read what it is that Jesus is going to say about this. So this text, like its message, is toward the end of the gospel. And the key theme, as I've said before, is the Messiah's glorious coming. And there are so many markers in this particular text of the historic apocalyptic discourse. What does apocalyptic mean? It means revelation or disclosure. The Greek word is apocalypto. Probably not pronouncing that right, but it means to reveal or disclose. So what's happening in this apocalyptic moment in Jesus' ministry is that he's revealing and disclosing. And what he's doing is drawing on, and he quotes it, the book of Daniel, which is an apocalyptic book, and really drawing on that with a lot of images that really are part and parcel to this apocalyptic narrative and this apocalyptic material. Actually, this genre of literature, the apocalyptic literature, flourished in the period before, about 200 years before Jesus' birth, and sustained through about 135 years after. And I would argue that there is a lot going on throughout history. There have been many seasons of the historic life that we have lived where these same images come forward. The moon is turning to blood. I mean, people, when the moon rises as it did the other night over Lake Michigan, and it's kind of a hue of pink or red, you know, my mind goes right to those texts. You know, I'm a Bible person. So, you know, you begin to say, oh, whoa, what's going on here? Or sky, you know, stars falling in the sky, you know, all of these kind of things that kind of make you pause and begin to think, is this the end, you know? And so, but on the other hand, it may not be where we go. And this is why I wanted to have this conversation. But it is true that Jesus was a person of the time in which he was living and drew upon those texts to try to provide a way forward for the disciples when they were asking these massive questions like, how do we endure? How do we stay the course? Okay, so I realize I'm doing a lot of talking, but I do need to kind of continue on. I hope you're all right with this. I just wanted you to get an idea of what the background of the passage was. And we do find this, where we find the text. And now I want to just delve a little bit into the structure of the particular passage we just read. And I'm going to focus on verses 3 through 30 or 31. So really the structure is in 3 through 14, the events prior to the Great Tribulation, if you read this. And I'll get to the theological question in 1 minute. And then the events prior to the Great Tribulation, the abomination and the Great Tribulation, 15 to 28. And then 29 and 30, Jesus coming in glory. And then after that, in this chapter are a couple of parables, the parable of the fig tree and a few others that are there. But this particular passage really focuses on tribulation and Jesus coming in glory. So I want to get to just a couple of theological considerations and then one more piece, and then we'll pause, and I would like to hear a little bit about what you're thinking about as I'm talking. So what are the theological questions raised by this text? And by that, how do we understand this text? So the first one is that the text discloses divine secrets concerning God's plan for the outcome of history and the final judgment. Secondly, the destruction of the temple anticipates God is about to come and establish rule. And if we think of the destruction of the temple as sweeping away what has been, then the assumption is, well, what's next? And the assumption by the disciples and the way that Jesus talks about that is that there will be an establishment of God's reign or God's rule on the earth. Now, is this a cosmological establishment? In other words, is God in Jesus going to come back to earth and wipe everything out, the destruction of the temple and all the evil that is afoot in the world? Or is the establishment of the realm of God on earth the work of the community of faith until the ultimate time when Jesus returns? So this is a question that I think is a really important one, because I think it's really a question of, is this about a kind of divine interference or a divine way of being in the world and making the change? Or is this really coming back to the community of faith, the church, the early church, to be the ones who are to wait and watch and work for the establishment of that reality? And I think that in many ways that is probably the watershed between the way that a lot of people read this text and honestly the way that Calvin and Luther and on into the narrative that leads us to the 21st century of the way that I believe that most Presbyterians would read this text, which is to say, watch and wait, and things get scary, and there may be signs and there may be things that are happening, but it's the purpose of the community to not just wait on the mountaintop until it arrives, the end arrives, but to be working out of this earlier narrative of the Sermon on the Mount, to be present in the world, to be basically ushering in the realm of God by the work that we do and by the presence of God in our lives. So it's an interesting difference of assumptions about what do we do in the meantime? If you're not coming back, and there was a lot in the biblical narrative that basically understood that Jesus was going to return before they had tasted death. And there's actually a text that says, before you taste death, I will come back. And there's confusion about what that is. And we can take that up sometime and try to understand what Jesus meant by that. But it can be, it was very confusing to that early Christian community, assuming that Jesus was going to return right away. And when we get to Paul next week, we'll see a lot of that discourse about, well, how do we wait? I thought you were coming back. You're not here yet. So-and-so has died. So where are you? And what are we supposed to do in the meantime? So this is really the interpretive challenge of the text. Very quickly, one more piece of this, which is that, and I think I mentioned to you before, that a lot of the imagery in Jesus' narrative here is drawn from the book of Daniel. It always just is so incredible to me how much at Jesus' fingertips he had the Hebrew Bible and all the prophetic materials and everything else. So at his fingertips, he was drawing on the major themes of flood and famine and war and earthquakes. And this whole thing about the birth pangs of a new age, you know, is coming. The new age is coming, and it's the birth pangs of something, but birth pangs can be pretty difficult. Having gone through birth 3 times, I can tell you. So, but I think we don't often, we're not so much trying to get fascinated with the rollout of signs, but realize that the biggest worry for the early Christian community was this worry that their relationship with each other would go cold. And what that meant was, for them was that the internal dynamics and the challenges of what was happening among the Christian community and the distress that they were feeling in internal strife was actually, in the way that I read this text, more dangerous than even these external signs of earthquakes and famine and all the things that were happening as signs of the end. And so, or signs of the earth in birth pangs. And the biggest worry for the gospel writer in Matthew was that the community, his community of early Christians, was coming unstuck. And I think in many ways, that for me is one of the challenges of this text. If I were preaching on this text, that would definitely be where I'd go, because I really think that in some ways, the intra difficulties that we're experiencing in this country, in our own lives, within the Christian community, with very different assumptions about who Jesus is, not just about end times, but about the way that we interpret our life of faith, that the intra challenges can sometimes be, and often are, pretty devastating to our understanding of our faith and how we live that out. So, okay, Allison, you want to go to the last slide before we get a little bit of pause here? So I want to give you just a real quick, in order to give you some language. There are 4 terms that I've been kind of throwing around that I want to at least define for you. So the first one is prophecy. People often, when they read, hear the word prophecy or prophesy, will assume that it is sort of a prediction, something like that. But the real term prophecy, as it's used in the biblical text, is an inspired declaration of divine will or purpose, which is very different than kind of trying to map out the order that things will happen that will lead to the coming of Jesus, or looking at, going to a range of people trying to figure out, fortune tellers and others trying to figure out what the future is. But it's also interesting that many of us live with a desire to know what's coming in our lives and what's next and what's coming in the world. So, but the real term of prophecy, and if you read the prophets, they're not so much predicting as they are stating the moment in which they're living and God's divine purpose or will for that moment. The next term is this term apocalyptic. Anybody that's watched Apocalypse Now or any of those type of movies have heard this term. But what it literally means, as I said earlier, is lifting the veil or revelation. So in a way, what Jesus was doing in this text and what we'll work with next week and the week after is kind of lifting the veil, helping us to see what is happening in a situation or a revealing, a revelation. And this whole literature of apocalyptic literature really is about kind of lifting the veil, helping us to understand and to see bigger meaning and larger sweeps of history and understanding. A lot of people will dismiss it and just say this is not anything we need to even look at because it's so antiquated, it has nothing to do with now. But I think what I'm trying to understand is its biblical narrative and how do we make sense of this for our time? So that's really the question that I'm carrying into the conversation. The third term, eschatology, probably heard this term, and it really literally means final outcome of human affairs or end times. That's the term. The eschatological understanding is the understanding of end times. Okay, and then the last term I wanted to put on there is the word providence, which is a very Presbyterian word. I put it on there because in some ways the providential understanding of who God is in the midst of all of these other things really is that God's power is a sustaining power, and that the assumption is that God is guiding human destiny, that God isn't just the kind of watchkeeper that starts it running and then steps away and says, okay, you all just mess it up and I'll just be watching what you're doing. But the providence is the sustaining assumption that God's power through Jesus is sustaining and guiding human destiny. Now, we could argue all these things and we could have a conversation about it, but I at least wanted to give you a sense of what the terminology was. So, Allison, I go to the next text. So there are several messages in this text. I'm going to go quickly through these. The first one is that the message in this Matthew is that, and I've said this before, faithful endurance of Christians to the end. So the mandate is that we stay, we endure to the end, whether it's the end of our life or the end of the world, that is the message. The second message is the end is near, and preparing the community for what is ahead. But what is the end? Does that mean the end of Jesus' life? Does that mean the end of the resurrection? Does that mean the end of Jesus coming in glory? Does it mean the end of a broken community? What does it mean to prepare for what is ahead? And the reminder is, you see here, God's faithfulness throughout time, and all time is God's time, and trusting that we have not been abandoned, and that these signs and these moments and this text is really a challenge to us to stay the course. Okay, there's one more, I think. And that Jesus is with us. I just said this, but Jesus' engagement is with us to the end of his earthly life. And this text is really to prepare his followers for what is ahead. And again, his followers are reading and hearing this message after he has died, after the temple is destroyed. And so how are they supposed to endure to the end? This is supposed to be not a creepy message, but a message of hope. And that, big things that are happening have an impact on where they are. Okay, so questions or thoughts real quick. And then I want to get you into some small groups to discuss. So you have any questions right now?
Did you say that the modern scholars, such as, Jesus Seminar and stuff, they think that these were authentic sayings?
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and a lot of it was, I mean, I haven't gone through the Jesus Seminar, looked at the exact words, because some of these texts are a conglomerate.
Right. But basically, they think there's a core here, a kernel here of actual sayings.
Yeah, and a lot of it is quoting from the book of Daniel. So a lot of the quotes, so, it could have been put in the mouth of Jesus by Matthew as they were asking this question, what's coming? But again, let me actually check on that, because I don't want to go, without doing an absolute check of whether scholars would put this in actual sayings of Jesus. But it's my understanding, since it shows up in 3 of the 4 gospels, it's pretty sure. Somebody else. Yeah, go ahead. I don't know who it is, but there's a call-in user. Wanted to ask a question. Maybe not. Other responses or other questions that you might have?
So I have a question. Is the end of times the coming of the kingdom of God here on earth and in heaven, like a new heaven and a new earth after the cataclysm of the apocalypse?
That's a really interesting question. And whether it's after the cataclysm of the apocalypse or preceding it. But the scholars, people that I've read and the commentators on these texts, basically, that's the watershed. Does it mean that Jesus' mandate was keep watching, keep waiting? You're going to have to endure a lot. You're going to have to go through a lot. And the early Christians went through a lot of persecutions. There were false prophets. There were people coming in trying to do, quote, false teachings to the early community. So was it, be assured that you're not the only ones that have had to go through these times. And as you're establishing and living out faith on this earth, there's going to be a lot of resistance to that. Does that mean the establishment, or is it more cosmic? Is it the very end times? And I think in a way, that's really the pivot question, Jim.
So if I could have a follow-up. So the Sermon on the Mount contains the Lord's Prayer. Is the Lord's Prayer an eschatological prayer, praying for the kingdom to come here on earth?
I think that's interesting.
Is that an eschatological? Are we praying for end times? That's my question.
Perhaps. But eschatology may not only mean very end. You know what I mean?
Well, that's right. It'd be a new beginning.
At the end of the day. So yeah, so it's a really interesting question. Well, you'll never say the Lord's Prayer again the same way, folks. Ted, did you have something, or Kathy?
Yeah, it kind of seems like we kind of want to have our cake and eat it too on this. We want to have almost the fear of terrible destruction to kind of discipline us on the one hand, and then the comfort that everything's going to be okay at the end times on the other hand. And so I'm a little frustrated in us Christians for not calling it a little bit on get rid of the fear, build in the hope. That these texts were meant to build us up, not to scare us or tear us down. But somehow over the years, Christianity has done a pretty good job of scaring people into whatever against the probability that they wouldn't benefit at the end time. So I'm kind of, I won't say angry, but I'm kind of mystified as to why Christianity can't make the call to interpret this in maybe the more hopeful sense rather than in the more scary sense that tends to kind of align with conspiracy theorists and the folks who like to invent all the negative stuff, even though there's plenty of negative around.
Yeah. Well, I think you've hit on one of the kind of historic nub issues of the function of religion and faith in the history that we've inherited. And I think, is religion really simply to try to control and to keep people in a fearful mode and to keep us from being able, fullness of life or flourishing? Is it more about control or is it more about freedom? And I think that for me is at a very, very important aspect of going to these texts, because this may be the first time for me, and maybe for all of us, that we read these texts not as scary and, putting us on edge. I mean, I grew up Baptist. I grew up laying in my bed when I was a little kid. And man, when I saw the lightning outside my window, I thought Jesus was coming, and I was terrified, And so I'll just put it there. So there's that, but to really understand that what Jesus was doing in this text was saying, or what Matthew, in the context of the audience he was giving these texts to, it really was, I think, more on the other side. So why have we never heard it, is your question. Why has that other interpretation tended to be the one that we've heard? I'm not going to answer it any fuller right now, but I really want you to hold that. I want everybody on the call to hold that question, because I think it is so absolutely important. As we look at the book of Revelation, we've got a lot of work to do to kind of move through that. Michael DeVries, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to comment on, this is more of a psychological observation, I guess, but so often I find that people, in terms of their own personal insecurities, tend to perceive and interpret the world then as coming to an end, or that we've reached the end times, just because their own life may be coming to an end, or they're anxious about their own future. And suddenly all the problems that they see in the world are now signs that the whole world is coming to an end.
Yeah. So essentially projecting that,
Right.
projecting their own personal thing, or to be able to interpret the world through that. Okay, there was a chat comment.
That's from Penn.
Finding the hope requires certain level of faith. That's true. Or persecution. A friend said this, a cognitive Christian point of view. Okay, that's really interesting. So obviously a relevant conversation. Amazing that came up this morning. So I realize we're almost at the end of our time, not the end times, but the end of our time. So what I'd like to do is, if you're willing to go into some small groups for about 8 minutes, I'm going to give you almost the rest of the time to do that. And a couple of questions, but I think I'd like for you to be able to talk to each other and not just listen to me. Read 31 is scary. Yeah, we didn't put 31 in there, but we can, and we'll go back to it. Okay, so the questions, suggested questions, but you don't have to talk about this. You can just talk about whatever you want to in terms of this. But one would be, in your own background as a Christian, what were you told about the end times? And maybe you didn't have any background as a Christian as a child or growing up, you're a new Christian, so maybe it's more cultural. But what were you told? What are themes, political or social issues arise in this biblical narrative? So what do you see in the world that we're inhabiting right now that might have relevance or be a question around this? And then what are the issues, implications for your own faith with this? So it's kind of a broad sweep, but more background. What do you bring? What do you see now? And what are the issues of faith? So if we could go in, I see we have about 7 minutes, Allison. So why don't we do 6? And then we'll come back together and close for this week. No problem. So I'm going to put you into some small groups. You all know how to do that. You just click, go in, and then we'll give you a warning when we'll be ready to come back. If we had enough time, I'd love to know what you talked about. Our discussion was really interesting, but we don't, because we're at our time. But let me just say, next week, when we pick up on Paul, I will not have as much background. I'll do a very quick overview for people that are joining us next week, and we will have a lot more time for this week's material and what we'll be taking up next week, which is basically Thessalonians is where a lot of the material in Paul shows up. So if you want to kind of browse through the letter First and Second Thessalonians, you can look at that in preparation for next week. Thessalonians is known to be probably the earliest of Paul's letters. So it's really aligned very closely with what we were looking at today in terms of timing. Let me make an offer to you that if you have questions or areas of this that you would like to explore over the next 2 weeks, would you please just send me a note? My email is on the church website, not hard to find. Just send me a note. I'll look at it and I will be happy to incorporate questions or puzzling or some insights you have about this text or about these texts, background that you bring that you've been confused about. I mean, it's kind of like an offer to just open the way, because I don't want to just be assuming or making assumptions about what's puzzling or what's exciting about these texts for you. So feel free, just pop me a note and send those to me, and I'll be glad to try to do some incorporation into what we're doing. So I wanted to finish by reading just a really quick paragraph or two from this book, Resident Aliens, Stanley Hauerwas, who's a theologian. It's sort of interesting that this particular material shows up in the lectionary, the series of readings we do for worship, the first Sunday in Advent. And I think it's fascinating that we kind of go to end times in the beginning of the church year. And that is the placement of the decision makers about what texts we read or what texts we use at that point. And so I thought it would be it's sort of an interesting understanding of Hauerwas as he would look at these texts. It's under the title End of the World, is this particular paragraph. He says, the church is on the long haul, living that difficult time between one Advent and the next. So we're living between one Advent and the next. In such times, we are all the more dependent on a community that tells us we live between the times, that it is all too easy to lose sight of the way the world is now that God has come. So the one Advent would be the coming of Jesus, death, resurrection, and then Jesus standing and admonishing the disciples in the ascension, when Jesus taken up, to say, why are you looking up at me? You need to look down and get to work, and so that was the kind of admonishment that Jesus gave to the people. So it's kind of like, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that we are still living in these in-between times. But Hauerwas goes on, because we know something about the direction in which the world is moving, we are encouraged by that picture and guided by the shape of its depiction of the way things are now that God has redeemed the world in Jesus. So in other words, we need to trust that God is not evaporated up into a heavenly realm, but that God has given us Jesus as the guide for our day-to-day life in these in-between times. And so we might think of these texts not as scary and sort of putting us on edge, but as hopeful and guiding and helping us see that as bad as we may think it is, that we're not alone and that God's got this one. So that's where I'd like to at least end today. And then we'll delve in next week, jump into some more difficult and challenging material as we look at the way that Paul understood the end times and that kind of what do we do now kind of thing. So thank you all very much for being part of this. I'm grateful for your willingness to hang in there. And next week we'll pick up, and then the following week we'll get to Revelation. And just so you know, the last week is Valentine's Day, but it's also the congregational meeting. And so we will meet that day, but it will be after the congregational meeting. So you might want to have some food or something you're welcome to eat while we're talking that particular day. But we will go ahead and do the Revelation right after the congregational meeting. So who knows what we'll discover.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
All right.
Lucy.
Thanks, Lucy.
Thanks,
Bye-bye,
Lucy.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Great.